about the scientific method, which you probably know about or have heard about from like elementary school and on, and also the laboratory report process. So how we do labs here at CASE and how you write labs. So they always are going to start out with a title, and a title makes it easy for the readers to quickly identify the topic. So for example, if we have a lab about, say, the pond ecosystem, you're probably going to be looking at something in a pond, and you're going to be looking at the ecosystem of that pond. So the title just tells you exactly what you're doing or what it's about. Titles will usually be given to you unless you are doing your own investigation at like the IB or higher levels. Also, there is a question also usually given to you, but sometimes, for example, if you're in the IB level or a higher up level, you have to investigate your own question. A question is what tells the reader exactly what the experiment will be researching. So it tells you exactly what you're doing. It tells you what kind of things you're going to be looking at and what you're changing. There's always a general format, so this is very important. So I would either highlight it all, I would make it a different color, make it a different font, make it bold. Just know that this is very important. It's going to tell us about the variables. So here you see the word variable, and that's going to be our topic of most of this lesson. So the general format of how we write a question is how does, and then we always have the independent variable first. Affect, so this is like our connecting word. And then we write the dependent variable. So what are these variables? What do they mean? What are they? I know there's two different kinds. Actually, there's probably three. But what do these words mean? So we are going to talk about these variables now, the three types. So our first one, like I said, is the independent variable. It is the variable that is deliberately changed. It is the one that the scientist changes in the experiment. So this is usually the one that you're investigating how it affects something else. So it's the one that you are changing or altering throughout the experiment. Next is our dependent variable. And this variable, the dependent variable, changes as a result of the independent variable. You can think of it as it depends on the independent. So independent means standalone on its own, and dependent means it relies on or needs the other one. So the dependent variable needs or will be changing because of the independent variable. The dependent variable is also what is being measured. So it is what you are collecting your data on. It is what you kind of are measuring or taking notes on, or the things you're collecting like weights or heights or things like that. The last type of variable is one you might be more familiar with. It's the control or the constant variable. These variables, there's usually more than one, have to remain the same throughout the entire experiment. Because if they were to change, they would alter your results, and then you would not have consistent results. So control variables must remain the same. There can only be one independent and one dependent variable. Otherwise, you would also get inconsistent results, and you would not understand your results fully, and in the scientific community, they would not be accepted. So there can only be one independent and one dependent. All other aspects of the experiment must remain unchanged. So you have to keep them steady. So these unchanged variables are the controls or the constants. And then we need to go to the other side. There's just a little bit more notes that we are going to take. So in our variable practice here, I personally like to write down that formula that I told you about with how we write questions. So I'm going to write a star because it's very important. Questions always start with how does. It's like a formula or a plug and play. So questions always, always, always start with how does. The next part of a question is, does anyone know? Independent variable comes next. And then we have that connecting word that I circled on the page before, and that word is effect. So when I read questions, I like to circle this word so that I know I'm looking for it. And then after the word effect is our dependent variable. So when we read a question, I like to do exactly this. I like to underline how does and circle the word effect. So as I read my question, I see the word how does. I'm going to underline it. How does the amount of exercise Paul does each morning affect? Well, what do I do with the word affect? I like to circle it. The time it takes him to run a kilometer. So it's a little more than a mile. So our independent variable, how are we going to figure this out? Well, you can try and just guess based on what the question is telling us, or we can go back up here to this formula or this plug and play that I wrote up here. So in between how does and effect, which variable are we seeing? Our independent variable, and that's what it's asking right here. So in between how does and effect, all of this information is technically our independent variable. So amount and then next it asks for our dependent variable. Where can we find our dependent variable? When in doubt, always go back to this plug and play formula up here. So we did how does independent variable affect? Oh, dependent variable. Dependent variables come after the word effect. So here is my circled effect. What comes after it? The time it takes him to run a kilometer. All of that now is our dependent variable. So this example is very specific. It talks about amount of exercise Paul does each morning and time to run a kilometer. So there's a lot of very specific things like morning, Paul has to do it, 1 kilometer. So those are probably going to be our control. So if you ever see anything super specific like amounts or times, that is going to probably be our control variable. So they have to stay the same. Another way to find your control variables is to think about if you did the experiment. So if you had a friend named Paul and you were timing how long it takes him to run a kilometer after doing exercise, think about some things that would need to be the same. So you're measuring a certain person, Paul, so that is one control. You write down Paul or the person. Another thing, we said it's in the morning. So some people have more energy in the morning, some people have more energy at night. So that is something that is specific. It needs to stay the same. The last thing that we talked about is how far he's running. So he's running a kilometer. So that needs to stay the same. It cannot change. Can't have him running 2 kilometers because that's going to give you a different time and you're recording the time. So I'm going to give you a few moments here to try your hand at number 2, question 2, and then we will go through it together. If you were stuck or if you like how I did it, the first thing I would do is read your question and do this formula. Remember, I always underline how does, so I see how does. And then I skim and I look for the word effect and I circle effect. So effect, here it is. I circle it. Next, it's asking for our independent variable. And remember, your independent variable is in between 2 things, how does and effect. So you go down, how does an effect? And oh look, it's our independent variable, temperature of a pot of water. Next, it asks for our dependent variable. If you're unsure of how to find it, again, go back up to our formula. So we did how does, we found the independent variable, so check, check. Then we have the word effect. Okay, so we have our word effect. And look, then after the word effect, dependent variable. So all this back here, dependent variable, the time it takes to cook an egg. So now you may not have ever cooked a specific egg before, but you probably have put on some water to boil. Maybe you're making mac and cheese, maybe you're making some ramen. I know mine's mac and cheese. But so if you have a pot of water on to boil, what are some things that need to stay the same in order for the time it takes to cook that thing to be measured? So what are some things you want to keep the same so that the only thing that's different is your time? So think about it. Do you think a different size pot might be changing if your pot is super small compared to if you have like a huge pot? Do you think that'll change how long it takes for the temperature of the water to increase? So I'm going to say the size of the pot. Think about what else. What if you have an overflowing pot compared to only 1 cup of water? So the amount of water you should probably keep the same. We need one more thing. Think about maybe stoves. So there's gas stoves, there's electric stoves. The stove in my apartment is kind of crappy and it takes a really long time to boil a little pot of water. Whereas then I go to my mom's house and it's done in a second. It's done. It's like boom, super hot. So maybe the stove that you're cooking it on. Maybe it's the type of egg. Maybe you, instead of getting, like, we don't know if they're talking about chicken eggs. We don't know if they're talking about duck eggs, turkey eggs, elephants don't lay eggs. They're mammals. But maybe platypus eggs. What about ostrich eggs? So it just says an egg. So maybe we want to be clear about what type of egg. So as you can see, control variables can have more than 3, but they all need to stay the same, and you need to be clear that they are the ones staying constant.